Right. Hi, everyone. I know a lot of us are just entering into the Zoom. We're just going to give everyone a couple of minutes to get to continue on coming into the webinar conference. So just wanted to say thank you to everyone as you all enter. If you want to, we'd love to. We're going to have a poll in just a second, but if you don't mind, we'd love to have you introduce yourself on the chat function. If you could just want to say your name and maybe where you are from or where you are currently in the world, and if you want to, your affiliation with FRN. It's just nice to see who's in the room, so you can feel free to just chat that over. And this is maybe hopefully an awesome way to get everyone a little bit loose and limber for participating in our conversation today with the amazing Emily Broad Leib. Because as I mentioned in a lot of the content that we sent out around this conversation today, we really want to make sure that Emily is hearing from all of you. I have 1,000 questions for Emily, but I want to make sure that all of you have your time with Emily as well. So great. So thanks again, everyone, for coming on. I'm just going to give it one more minute. So when my clock hits 2:03, I'm going to formally start the conversation, and we can definitely bring some folks in. This part of webinars always feels very much like doing an Instagram Live to me, where it's just sort of this really interesting space. Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really great connection. This is awesome. And thank you. Thanks so much. And I'm hoping that I'm saying your name correctly, Lily or Lily. Thank you for joining us. This is so wonderful to have everyone here. Oh, wonderful! Yay! I have a dear friend from my upbringing. Her name is Lily as well, so that's really nice. I haven't heard someone with that name in a very long time. So thank you, everyone, for being with us today. Before we get started with a poll, just again, in a different way to see who's in the room, I wanted to do a few quick things before I turn things over to Elaine. The first is I too wanted to do a land recognition. We start our conversations at Food Recovery Network with a land recognition to honor and recognize our ancestors and the modern day peoples who are on the lands that we all live on. And where I am here in Washington, D.C., and in the Maryland and Virginia area that makes up the DMV here, the land that I inhabit, that I'm on right now, is the land of the Piscataway Conoy. They are still an active band to this day. They have a museum in Maryland, and they have a presence on Instagram for anyone who might want to learn more about the Piscataway Conoy. And I've been trying to do a little bit more research about them, as I've mentioned in some of our previous recordings. I haven't really gotten too much farther yet. I've tried, but I think my next thing is I want to go down there and see if I can meet people in person. So I will keep everyone updated on that. And two other announcements. The first is, we also start these conversations with a recognition that Black Lives Matter, and that we stand with our Asian community to stop Asian hate. And pretty soon, I'm going to transition that sentiment, that feeling, that understanding in different ways moving forward, because I know that it is a pursuit based in equity. It is a pursuit based in love. It is a pursuit based on an understanding of our history that brings us to our present as we strive for a more equitable future together. And that means that we might need to change the language or update the language on how we mean that. So many of you are informed of FRN's strategic framework, our FRN 10X framework that we talk about, that will see our transformation over the next 10 years. And that framework is centered in equity. And that is not something that I necessarily say all the time. There's a lot of what we call subsumation. So there's a lot of compactness. When I say the framework, when we unpack that, that means a lot of different things. That means systems change. It means feeding people today. It means equity is at the center. So I just wanted to say that too, as we think about how I will begin to acknowledge and welcome everyone to our actual conversations together. So thank you all for that. The next quick thing I wanted to say is, we've come together. I've been hosting these almost monthly conversations with a variety of amazing folks. And so not only is equity at the center, but at Food Recovery Network, we work in food. We want to make sure people have the food that they deserve. That is also at our center. And so now for these almost monthly conversations, we have a name for them. You might have noticed. And so we are naming this Intersectionalities in Practice. And right before, everyone started to join us for this conversation, Emily and I were talking about, these intersections and food. So funny enough, Emily, because food touches everything that we do. It touches every single person on this planet. And within that, we wanted to have conversations with food, among food, as it touches, overlays with other very important aspects of our lives. So that's why we've had conversations around compassion, why we've had conversations around women in leadership, and today why we're having this conversation around food policy. And we're going to dig in more to that. So again, thank you all so much for being here. My name is Regina Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Food Recovery Network. It is my honor to do this work every single day. And very much so, it is my honor to introduce everyone to Elaine Loskamp. And Elaine actually has been on the FRN team for not quite a year yet. And Elaine joins us from after graduating from college. Elaine was very active on her Food Recovery Network chapter. And so as a very former student and an alum of FRN, and active working full-time here at the national office, I wanted to ensure that Elaine has space, because a lot of you, as you come onto these conversations, will get to know Elaine more. But I will also wanted to, before the pandemic, I said to everyone, I want to bring in, more and more of the student voices in the work that we're doing, from the national perspective. We know all the awesome stuff you're doing on your college chapters and in your communities. So in terms of inviting you to come with me to meetings as I talk to other stakeholders and having opportunities to speak, the pandemic seems like it might have put a wrench in that, but no, here we are. And so I wanted to make sure that, we gave Elaine space and opportunity to use her voice. So Elaine, thank you so much for joining us, for helping us with this actual conversation, but I know that you also wanted to introduce Emily.
Awesome, thank you so much, Regina. Absolutely. So our guest today is Emily Broad Leib. She is a clinical professor of law, the faculty director of the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic, and the deputy director of the Harvard Law School Center for Health Law and Policy Innovation. As the founder of the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic, Emily launched the first law school clinic in the nation devoted to providing clients with legal and policy solutions to address the health, economic, and environmental challenges facing our food system. Emily focuses her scholarship, teaching, and practice on finding solutions to today's biggest food system issues. She has published scholarly articles in the Wisconsin Law Review, the Harvard Law and Policy Review, the Food and Drug Law Journal, and the Journal of Food Law and Policy, among others. She was named to 2016's list of Most Innovative Women in Food and Drink. The list, released by Fortune and Food and Wine, highlights women who had the most transformative impact in the last year on what the public eats and drinks. Her groundbreaking work on food waste